So our next guest up is needs no introduction because of the amazing work that he is doing. I'm super excited to invite Cliff Albright, who's the co-founder of Black Voter Matter Fund and BVM, the Capacity Building Institute, which is building community and organizational capacity related to Black voting power to the stage. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
No problem, no problem. So I want to jump right in because we know what happened yesterday. We know what is continuing to happen today, which is the realistic fact that since Black folks, since women of color have been given the right to vote, they have been slowly trying to take it from us. And so I'm curious for you, as we continue to see the onslaught of what's happening against our voter rights, can you tell us what we need to be doing right now to push back on the offense, or I should say the defense?
Right. Yeah, well, or offense or defense, right? Because we believe in both. And let me just say, I want to thank you all for doing all this. I want to thank Shane for testifying just a few minutes ago. And, you know, when I think about what it is that we need to be doing, I think the first thing that we need to do is for all of us to recognize is that being involved in this battle for voting rights, being involved unapologetically and saying that we demand our voices, we demand these rights that we were supposed to have going back to, you know, post-slavery, post-Reconstruction, demanding power over ourselves, our lives, our communities, sometimes our own bodies, that there is nothing wrong with that demand, right? So before we can even get to what we need to be doing, like concretely in terms of tactics, in terms of protests and actions, like what we saw yesterday, where sisters, you know, led by Representative Joyce Beatty, were at the Senate office building to demand our voting rights. Before we can even talk about that, we first have got to accept that we need and deserve power. And sometimes, and one of my favorite quotes, and it's why I'm so honored to be speaking on this day, is, you know, one of my favorite quotes comes from Dr. King, where he was dealing with this issue, of, especially in the late 60s, how do I deal with this demand for power that we were seeing coming out of Black communities, especially younger Black folks? How do I deal with this request for power at the same time that I maintain our insistence on love? And what he recognized and what he encouraged all of us to recognize is that those two things are not in contrast. They are not opposites. They actually have to go together, right? What he said was that power without love is reckless and abusive. And we don't want that. But also, we don't want the opposite, which is love without power is sentimental and anemic. And so he said we got to recognize that these two things have got to go together. In fact, power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And so that's what we're trying to do with our work with Black Voters Matter. That's what we're trying to do in terms of fighting for our voting rights and fighting against this voter suppression, this Jim Crow voter suppression. We are trying to say that power at its best is love, implementing the demands of justice. And we're going to do whatever we have to do in the spirit of love for our community, even in the spirit of love for our opposition. Because love, part of love, and this is the part that's left out a lot of times, is that we've got to be, love requires that we bring correction. I correct and rebuke those that I love. I correct and I rebuke and I give and I hold accountable those that I love, whether it's from my children, when they do wrong out of love, I correct them, or whether it's friends and partners or others. Love requires that correction, right? And so that's what we're trying to do when we're fighting against these wrongs and when we're fighting for our rights and when we're trying to correct those that are doing wrong. Even that is out of the spirit of love. And so what we are doing is that we are encouraging folks to get involved in reaching out to elected officials, get involved in doing phone calls and texting and all of that, but also get involved the way that John Lewis used to talk about getting involved in terms of good trouble. That's what yesterday's action was. And if you don't know about it, you can you know, Google or tweet or search on social media to see the action that took place yesterday. But we're going to be doing more of that all next week, going to those who are responsible for our voting rights, for voting on our voting rights, for delivering the promise of our voting rights. We're taking it to them, to the streets, to their offices, in peaceful way, in the spirit of love, to demand the rights, to demand the passage of voting rights legislation that we're waiting for and that's pending in Congress. We've got to deliver on our on voting rights, and in the spirit of love, we're going to do whatever we can to use the power that we have.
I'm so happy that you mentioned love, because I think oftentimes we hear from the opposition is this idea that should Black folks get any level of real power, right, in this country, is that we're going to do to them what they have traditionally done to us. But what's different about us is that we oftentimes come from a space of love, right? This is not about us trying to punish the opposition, but it's a recognition of how do we ensure that everyone from a wide range of communities can be at the table to make our country and our world that much better. Which is why I think, the Supreme Court decision that just happened a few days ago for Arizona is so critical for us to address, because we're going to see more potential decisions like that happen around the country as the opposition continues to try to, take our voting rights away from us. In Arizona, the Supreme Court just upheld 2 pieces of legislation, one in which bans the collection of absentee ballots from anyone who is other than a relative or a caregiver. And then the second piece of legislation allows for absentee ballots to be thrown out if they're not from that particular precinct. What does this mean? And what are some of the things we should be looking for as we continue to see legislation like this happen around the country?
Yeah, when you look at that Arizona legislation, a couple of things stand out. One, you mentioned some of the provisions dealing with your addresses and absentee ballots and who can pick them up. One of the things that's important to note that in Arizona, in the case of Arizona, unlike where I am right now, which is in Georgia, where the voter suppression bill here was largely targeted to Black folks, in Arizona, you look at those provisions and who are they going to impact? Yeah, it's going to impact some Black folks, but it's going to impact Latino folks, and it's going to impact our indigenous brothers and sisters who, based on where they live, sometimes in their tribal nations, they depend on, because of transportation issues and geography issues, they depend on loved ones, friends, trusted people in their community to come in and to help them to get those absentee ballots delivered. So that legislation was aimed squarely at our indigenous brothers and sisters in the state of Arizona. Again, in the spirit of love, when we say Black voters matter, there's no only that comes after that, right? There's no only Black voters matter, right? We're unapologetic about speaking to our issues, but we also recognize that there's other folks, other marginalized communities that are impacted by this legislation. So what you mentioned in Arizona, you see in the same trends in Georgia, in the Texas bill, which we were successful at defeating one time, and we're going to be successful at defeating the second time around. It includes criminalization, increased penalties, criminal penalties for people for honest mistakes, whether it's mistakes in registering folks or with absentee ballots, or in the case of Texas, even just elected officials that mail out ballots to voters can be criminalized. And so we're seeing these criminal penalties in all these bills. And the last thing I'll say is that perhaps the most dangerous and the most Jim Crow-ish piece of this legislation is that a lot of these have these provisions that make it easier for these states, red states, states that tried to overturn the 2020 election, but they weren't able to do so. A lot of these bills make it easier for them to do exactly what some folk were trying to do in 2020, which is to actually overturn elections, even after we're successful at overcoming the voter suppression. So all of these bills are incredibly dangerous, and we agree with what the president said the other day. It's the most dangerous attack on voting rights since the Civil War.
Wow, it's as an educator, I never want to assume, Cliff, that people understand the issues that we're talking about, right? So in a nutshell, if you will, give a brief explanation as we close out of what the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is designed to do, and then why does voting rights in 2021 still remain such a polarizing issue? So 2-part question.
Great question, because there's actually a lot of confusion about that, even from folks that do this work, because you've got a couple of different bills. You've got the For the People Act, which is also known as HR1 or S1. That's the one that's being considered. There was actually a vote a week or two ago, not on the bill itself, but on whether or not to even debate the bill. They couldn't get to the debate on the bill because of this thing called the Senate filibuster. And so that's a much longer discussion. But what that bill does is basically it expands voting rights in ways that we've actually never seen, national day of voting. It makes it easier for people to do voter registration. It guarantees a certain number of days and hours for voting. And so it would expand access to the vote in a way that we haven't seen, even in ways that the 1965 Voting Rights Act didn't necessarily do. It's also got other provisions that deal with things like gerrymandering, the way that districts are drawn so that politicians aren't able to pick their voters, but the voters are better able to pick their elected officials. So it deals with campaign finance. And so it's got some other pieces, but some of the voter access pieces alone make it a truly expansive and historic bill. That's H.R. 1 S1, the For the People Act. That's pending in the Senate right now. Then you've got H.R. 4, which is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. This is critical because what this act would do is it seeks to strengthen the 1965 Act, which was weakened 8 years ago by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court actually just weakened it to another degree just a couple of weeks ago with another decision that they just gave that weakens another provision in that Voting Rights Act. But the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, H.R. 4, would re-strengthen at least one of those sections in the Voting Rights Act. It's the section that would allow the federal government to have to pre-clear certain changes in states before those changes could become law. So when you see things like what happened in Georgia and what they're trying to do right now in Texas, before a state could pass certain restrictions on voting rights, it would have to get cleared by the federal government, by the Justice Department first. That's critically important because that's what enabled, and that's since 1965, that's been what has made it difficult for states to have to pass something, and then we have to go back and correct it. We have to go back and sue them and litigate them and get it corrected. The Voting Rights Act, Section 5, made it possible so that we wouldn't have to go that far. They would have to get it pre-cleared ahead of time. That was weakened 8 years ago. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act would seek to bring that back.
Excellent. And if you could just give us real quick one practical step that we can apply in our daily lives in terms of how we can help end voter exclusion, voter suppression, et cetera.
One step you can do is find an organization that's dealing with these issues, follow them. You can follow us, Black Voters Matter, on social media. It's Black Voters MTR. Follow us, follow organizations like Fair Fight, follow the NAACP, follow the Poor People's Campaign, which has been very active on these issues. Follow the King Center. But find a group that is dealing with these issues, that has reliable and trusted information, and follow them, because all of those groups, including ours, every day we're putting out information about what phone numbers you can call. How do you call your senator? What scripts or what language do you use when you're communicating with them? How you can get involved in sending text messages. So find a group that's doing this work, a trusted group, follow them, and then follow the actions that they're doing. Everybody can be involved. Everybody can be an organizer.
Yeah, I love how you said that, reliable and trusted information. Thank you so much, Cliff, for lending us some of your time today. We look forward to circling back and on these conversations and continuing to learn.
Thank you.